Hello, everybody, and welcome to our TropWATER webinar, the second webinar this week, actually. So hopefully some of you have tuned in to the first webinar on Tuesday. So my name's Abby. I'm a researcher here at the Nommabudda campus in Cairns, and so I'll be delivering one of the presentations today, along with Dr. Steve Lewis and Dr. Adam Canning from TropWATER. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that we're on today. So I'm coming to you from the Cairns Nommabudda campus, and we are on the land of the Irukandji and Jabagai people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also to all of the traditional owner groups whose land that we've worked on for this research. So this session is being recorded and it will be available on the TropWATER website, and so will the first session this week. So there's two sessions that have taken place around flooding and cyclones. So today we're talking about flooding, cyclones, and damage and recovery cycles in coastal Great Barrier Reef ecosystems. So there'll be an open Q&A at the end of the session after all three presentations. So you can pop your questions into the chat function, and also you can raise your hand and you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask us any questions that you have at the end. We will also have a survey at the end of the event, so we'd really appreciate your feedback that can help us improve TropWATER events going forward. So our first presenter is Dr. Steve Lewis, so I'll hand over to him to kick us off today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Thanks, Abby. Today I'm going to talk about the influence of flooding and newly delivered sediments in the Great Barrier Reef. Apologies to those of you who were there for Tuesday. You're going to have to endure me again for another 15 minutes or so. On Tuesday, I really spoke about the catchment work on flooding and droughts and the influence on sediment loads and catchment conditions. Now, this presentation is going to sort of talk about what those big influences of those flooding events and the influence, and considering that influence of the newly delivered sediments in the Great Barrier Reef. So first up, I'd just like to, I know on Tuesday I spoke a lot about the Burdekin, and here I thought I'd start the presentation with this shot of us sampling at the Burdekin River at Inkerman Bridge. This is sort of the end of catchment site of the Burdekin. The river channel here is about 1 kilometre wide. The Burdekin, while we're interested in it, while it's the biggest river in Australia in terms of annual average discharge, and it's also the single biggest contributor of sediment loads to the Great Barrier Reef. So we're very particularly interested in looking at where the sediment's coming from, doing the catchment budgets, and then, of course, where that newly delivered sediment's going into the Great Barrier Reef and what it's doing. I like to show this video to the students too, because, you can see that perspective of the sampling there. The channels are 1 kilometre wide. At this point in time, it's about 5 or 6 metres deep. The water's running here, and we're collecting a 10-litre bucket of sample. How characteristic is that of the sediment going out of the system at that point in time? Well, it turns out there has been a lot of monitoring at this site across the channel and through the water profile as well. And it shows that the sediments are very well mixed in this part of the river. So we can be very confident the work we're doing here, we're getting concentrations to calculate sediment loads. And we're doing also the geochemistry of the sediment to trace that sediment back up to a catchment source, but also the sediments in the plumes that we're monitoring, in the Great Barrier Reef, and tracing that back to the catchment as well. So, of course, for the Burdekin, on average, average loads are about sort of 3 to 4 million megalitres, but in those big events, we typically see up to 15 million megalitres coming out of the river at that time. So where does this newly delivered sediment go in the Burdekin? Well, there was a study that we did a little while ago now where we collected 5 sediment cores in the known sediment deposition areas of the Burdekin River, where most of the sediment can fall out. So these are the sites here. We took sediment cores. This is the one from the mouth of the Burdekin River and right at the mouth in Upstart Bay. And we use this pretty cool technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which essentially dates the last time grains of quartz have seen light. So it actually is dating the burial age for that sediment. So, this is a 2.5 meter core. We dated the bottom of that core to 100 years ago. That gives us sediment accumulation rates of 25 millimeters per year. We go to this site at the end of Bowling Green Bay, just off the tip there. The last 200 years of that core, that's accumulation rates were 9.4 millimeters per year. It turns out that core went back a little bit further and went back to about 600 years ago. And in that period from 200 years ago to 600 years ago, the sediment accumulation rates at that site was 1 millimeter per year. So that gives us another line of evidence of the sort of scale of the increase in the sediment loads coming from the Burdekin River. These other couple of sites, though, in this area in Bowling Green Bay, in crossing the bay and Cleveland Bay, we had little deposition in this core over the past 1,500 years and no deposition in this core over the past 4,000 years. So essentially the sediments in those cores at the top, towards the top, were last buried between 1,500 years ago at this 2CO site and 4,000 years ago in the Cleveland Bay site. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out where the Burdekin River is discharged, it's never discharged at this Upstart Bay site over this whole time period. And in fact, it's had different discharge points in the Bowling Green Bay and Upstart Bay over the last 8,000 years ago, when sea level has been roughly in its present position it is now. It turns out it's evolved times in the last 8,000 years. And lo and behold, the last time the Burdekin discharged in this part was 1,500 years ago. And the last time the Burdekin discharged roughly where the Horton River Channel is today was about 4,000 years ago. So this information tells us that the sediment that's deposited from the Burdekin initially is probably not going very far. So probably in terms of 80 to 90% of the sediment load falls out near the mouth of the Burdekin River and doesn't go very far, but it's a sediment that's transported in the flood plumes. That 10, 20% of this finer sediment fraction that's less than 20 microns is what's traveling further north and impacting our areas of seagrass meadows and coral reefs along this inshore part of the Great Barrier Reef. And this is what the sediment looks like under a microscope when it reaches this point in time, where you can see these are the particles in the river here in the arrows, these nice opaque rounded particles, and they range in size from about 1 to 20 microns, right? So it's that less than 20 micron fraction that's preferentially being carried in the plume. This translucent material is things like bacteria and fungi that are feeding on the nutrients on this sediment particle, as well as fecal sort of matter from photoplankton and zooplankton, like this fella here. You can see the head and the tail that's captured in this sediment flock. So this is a sediment that's traveling further, that's influencing our light regimes that I'm going to talk about in a moment too. What we do in our marine monitoring program is we try to characterize flood plumes, and we'll go and collect samples, but we'll also do flood plume surveys occasionally in these very big events by on helicopter, like we did this year in 2025, and also in 2019 with the big event from the Burdekin. We went out and captured some really spectacular images of the Burdekin plume coming over Old Reef there as well. Of course, as I've already showed you some images, we can track the plume movements by satellites, and the satellites are getting better almost with every year going by. They have higher resolution, and you can track their movements of the plumes almost daily, because we have a few going over our area every day. And you can sort of see where the really turbid water's near the mouth of the Burdekin. As the plume starts moving northwards, you see the water starting to turn that greener colour, where we're starting to see a little bit more light in the upper water column, which allows the photoplankton to start taking up those dissolved nutrients in the plume. So this is what the buckets of water actually look like when we go and collect samples in the plume as well, which of course we also do. So you can see towards the mouth of the Burdekin, turbid water. So we're seeing concentrations. At this particular time in 2019, we got concentrations of 590 milligrams per litre. This can go up range from probably 200 milligrams per litre all the way up to about 2,000 milligrams per litre, depending on where the water's coming from in the Burdekin and the stage of the river discharge. But as you can see, as we move further northwards along the coast, the water starts to look a lot clearer. So, as we get to Orchard Rocks off around Magnetic Island, we're at 2 milligrams per litre and 0.5 milligram per litre. So you're probably saying, Stephen, look, there's hardly any sediment in that water at all, right? Well, it turns out we can actually pump this water through a SETI pump and filter it through this 1 micron string filter. And with over 2 to 3 hours, we can filter about anywhere from 3 to 5,000 litres of water. Sounds like a lot of water, right? But when you think about it, that is equivalent of about 1 square metre area and 5 metres of water depth, right? So when we do that, that 5,000 litres of water or so, and we recover that water, this is what the buckets look like. At the Havana Island site, remember it was 0.5 milligram per litre. This is what is when you pump about 5,000 litres of water that you recover that's dispersed within that water column. And so even at those concentrations, there's still very, very little light getting down to, the corals and seagrass that are growing, at that 5 to 10 metres depth. And again, at Orchard Rocks here, at 2 milligrams per litre, the water looks pretty much of what we saw at the Burdekin River mouth. The other neat thing we can do now, we've got that sediment concentrated. We can, look at that under the microscope and look at what's in the water, and we can do the chemistry of that sediment and actually trace that back to what we saw at the mouth of the Burdekin, at the, Inkerman Bridge, what we've measured there, but also where it's come from in the upper catchment area as well of the Burdekin. And you can see here, just under the microscope for this Orchard Rock sample, the water started to turn a little bit greener. So you do see these diatoms in here, which is our photoplanktons, the rounded diatoms and the needle-like diatoms. But we also see our dinoflagellates as well and our mud flocks of the material that's come from the end of the river. In the depth sample, where there's not enough light for the photoplankton to come in, we don't see those diatoms. We just see essentially the sediment flocks coming from the end of the river. We also, in the marine monitoring program, take water column profiles of the salinity and the light and turbidity and things like that within our conductivity, temperature, depth meter that we take our casts. So here we can see, this is just an example from 2022. I can't show you the 2025 data just yet because it's still under embargo. But essentially you can see this is the salinity, and these are the sites towards the mouth, moving offshore to our sites up around the Palm Island area, right? And the salinity is this black line, the light is this orange line. And essentially what the data show is as we move further offshore, you see this freshwater lens that's concentrated in the upper few meters of the water column. And as the plume moves further offshore, this freshwater lens mixes deeper down to about 10 to 15 meters. And as with time goes on, it mixes throughout the water column with the higher salinities. And we saw that in 2025, where we collected about 4 to 5 different time periods of casts over a month of that big Burdekin plume in February this year. And we saw that actually that evolution of the plume through time. The light sensors also show that there's very little light beyond about 5 meters depth. Like the light very quickly extinguishes down to virtually no light getting beyond 5 meters. And again, in 2025, over that whole month campaign of sampling, we saw very little light beyond that sort of 5 meters in the water column. So now I've sort of covered the Burdekin. I wanted to sort of just quickly shift into the wet tropics area. And, I talked about how good the satellite images are becoming. This is a Sentinel-2 satellite image from the 6th of February this year, showing the floodwaters moving in the marine environment off the Tully and the Herbert rivers. Very spectacular images coming through. Probably the most famous image from this year, where you can see that plume waters stretching out onto the mid-shelf reefs here off the wet tropics, and this highly turbid water on the inshore Great Barrier Reef, and the role of the islands, that the seaward side of the islands are essentially, being protected from those highly turbid waters through what we call the island wake effect. So these seaward side of the islands, you can see that there's water upwelling behind those islands, and the water remains relatively cleaner than the ones that are the side that's facing the land. And we actually see that in some of the monitoring that's gone on, that the corals that were on this side of the island fared much better in these conditions than what they did when the ones that are on more the leeward side of the island. We also looked at sediment loggers and sediment traps as part of a NEST project that's concluded about 5 years ago. We had sites in Cleveland Bay, the Palm Islands, and off Dunk Island, where we had these running for about 4 years or so. This is just an example to show the influence of that newly delivered sediment on a reef, for example, at Dunk Island, where what we've get, this top graph shows the sediment trap accumulation, so how much sediment we've captured in the trap, and we've normalized it for the length of time that trap was out there, which is typically about a 3-month period. So we normalize it to a rate of milligrams per centimeters per day, and you can see the highest trap accumulation rates always coincide with when there's good flood events happening from the Tully and the Herbert rivers in this Dunk Island area. We also looked at the nutrient contents of these traps, and always coinciding with those river flood, that delivery of the new sediments also coincide with the highest concentrations of total organic carbon and total nitrogen. So it's this nutrient organic rich sediments that are coming in from the rivers and also we see it in these sediment under the microscope as well, right? We see these flocks only in the sediment traps that coincide with the wet season. We don't see these flocks happening in the dry season. So sort of multiple lines of evidence of that newly delivered sediment getting out to these sites. Now, I probably don't have a lot more time to talk about this, but just there's other studies that have come out to show that link between that newly delivered sediment and onphotic depth in the Great Barrier Reef. So very quickly, in a dry year from the Burdekin, and this is true for the other rivers as well, in a dry year, you can see the photic depth naturally drops off during the wet season. But if you're a coral or a seagrass growing at 10 meters depth, you've got enough light over that whole year, essentially, to keep going. Whereas you have a wetter year, that photic depth plunges below that level, and you've got very little light for a good 4 to 5 months of the year. Now, a seagrass or coral might be able to have enough energy stores to survive it for 1 year. But when we get consecutive years, this is where we start having those problems with very little light for long periods of time. And this is what we sort of saw in the seagrass meadows in Cleveland Bay. This is the colours represent the seagrass area, and the different colours represent the different species of seagrass. And in this 5-year period, we had 4 of the 5 years had above average Burdekin River flows, with quite very large to extreme flood years from the Burdekin in 2008, 2009, and 2011. And you can initially see that contraction of that seagrass meadow area at the deeper margins moving back. And then, of course, in 2011, we had Tropical Cyclone Yasi that came in and took out that shallow seagrass meadows as well. And then that had the knock-on effects for the dugongs and turtles afterwards. And this sort of matches some of the loggers that we had at our seagrass site in Cleveland Bay as well during 2019. We had quite a big resuspension event initially, then the big Townsville and Burdekin floods, where we had very little light or no light for extended periods. And then following that delivery of the new sediment with some of the resuspension, we had very little light in those months preceding that. So that sort of data backed up there. So that sort of helps to probably get an idea of the light is very important with that newly delivered sediment. And with that, Abby will talk about now more the seagrass and the coral responses with that newly delivered sediment. So thank you, and I'll pass you over to Abby.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so as Steve's kind of nicely led into there, I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of cyclones and flooding on inshore marine habitats, and bring you a bit further north to North Queensland, and really focus on some of the work we've been doing around Cyclone Jasper and what we know about the trajectories of recovery for these marine habitats. So this work has really been a collaboration in terms of the Cyclone Jasper work that I'm going to focus on. So that's all of the logos there of the traditional owner groups we've worked with and our funders, and working with Katie and Sky as well. And I'll also talk a bit about some of the other work that our team does, linking that into the port surveys up here in Cairns. So Steve's really kind of covered off on what the impacts of flooding can be. So what do we need to consider in terms of cyclone impacts on the marine ecosystem? And this is a story told through an interesting graphic that I've put together for you. I'm not super artistic. So when we have a cyclone, it'll come and it'll hit the outer reef. And what we can often see is some of that physical damage, corals being knocked off and displaced, turned over. And as that moves inshore, we can get some of the seagrass meadows and mangroves being displaced as well. But what we've really been seeing with a lot of the recent cyclones is that flooding that comes afterwards is the real impact on the inshore marine ecosystem. It brings with it these floodwaters that Steve was talking about, and they are, as he's mentioned, laden with sediment. They can also reduce salinity in these coastal environments for quite a long period of time and can bring down nutrients from the catchment. And so these sediment loads can reduce light. And Steve covered off on this quite nicely in terms of this light reduction can be a problem for the seagrasses and the corals, but it's really those extended impacts and those repeated impacts that can cause problems. So today I'm going to focus in on talking about the coastal marine ecosystem. So what I'm talking about there is really those coral reefs and seagrasses right offshore of the coast, as opposed to the corals that are further off that the tourist vessels might go and visit. So just important context when we're thinking about the results of some of this work. So, in terms of understanding the impacts of some of these weather events on our marine ecosystems, we have a few different sources of data that we can use in Queensland. So, our team monitors ports locations throughout Queensland, and that's annual monitoring, at least annually, some locations more than once. And then there's some post-flood or cyclone monitoring that's been activated. So that's what I'll talk about after Cyclone Jasper, and also down in Hervey Bay and in other locations, we do monitor in response to these events. And there's also the MMP monitoring, so that's transect scale monitoring at certain locations up and down the coast in Queensland. Probably more dots than I've got on there, but it gives you an idea. It's spread throughout. So, in terms of the ports and kind of post-cyclone monitoring, how do we collect this data? Well, we go out at low tide and we'll survey in the helicopter and get as much information as we can. And when we're in the seagrass meadow, we're collecting meadow scale data. So, understanding the area of the seagrass, the species, and how much seagrass is there. Which is the difference between the transect scale data and meadow scale monitoring that we're doing as part of these surveys. And we're also collecting data from the boat. So you can see here, this is some footage from our recent survey. And this is Barry, and he's lowering a camera over the side of the boat. And we've got a live feed back up to the boat. So we're collecting data, not just on seagrasses, on all of the habitats that are on the seafloor. So whether that's corals, algae, oysters, we're recording everything that's there to give us a real picture of the marine environment. So I'm going to focus on Cyclone Jasper and some of the impacts that we've recorded after this. So if you don't know about Cyclone Jasper, or if you didn't live through that in Cairns, it was in December 2023. It was a Category 2 cyclone, which became a low pressure system, and it led to catastrophic flooding. So many places had over 1,000 millimeters of rainfall in 24 hours. And peak river heights in the Annan, Bloomfield, and Normanby rivers were between 3 and 4 meters above the historic flood maximum. So, really, really extensive flooding. And it was concentrated up in Wujal, which is where the cyclone hit, but these flood impacts extended much further south as well, as we'll see. So one of the big features of Cyclone Jasper was the landslides. So thousands of landslides throughout the landscape. So you can see here, this is Cedar Bay, which is where there was one of the biggest landslides, and this exposed 11 hectares of bare soil. So you can imagine the amount of sediment that's coming out to the outer reef. And you can see in the background there just thousands and thousands of landslides. Sorry, not the sediment coming to the outer reef, although that is important because the flood plumes were recorded all the way to the outer reef, but really concentrated on these inshore marine ecosystems. So kind of adding to the stress of that flooding, those low salinities, low light, sediment loads as well. So a very stressful time for the marine ecosystem. So in response to this, we wanted to look at the impacts across the ecosystems of the Great Barrier Reef. So we looked at mangroves, coral, and seagrasses. Adam is going to talk after I talk about mangroves, so he'll cover off on that. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we saw in the coral and seagrass space and what the prospects for recovery look like. So in terms of corals, it's important to note that we did see some live corals, so especially out on the island. So that photo there is from Low Isles, but also on Hope Islands and kind of the deeper corals throughout the area in the subtidal were alive. But what we saw on the intertidal reefs, on the inshore reefs, was this kind of coating of mud across these reefs, which had not survived. Some of these had clearly died before Cyclone Jasper. They were quite eroded, but you can see in this video, this death looks quite fresh, and you could still see the coral skeletons under all of this. So the mud is still sitting on top of all of these reefs, and it still looks kind of similar this year. So um, big impacts on those inshore corals. And there's not that much data about what they looked like before, but we teamed up with Johnny Gaskell, who's a marine biologist who lives locally, and he had some drone imagery from before the cyclone at three of those inshore reefs. And so I'll just highlight one of these, which is at Wangeti Beach. You can see before Cyclone Jasper that there was really healthy coral cover here, which is actually kind of quite surprising for an inshore reef and something that not many people might have noticed, given that it's a bit crocky to go for a swim around there. But afterwards, you can just see that mud sitting over the top, and these corals. Yeah, there's not really any live coral left on those reefs. And I should say that we have a report on all of this, and that's available on the TropWATER website. And that goes for everything that I'm talking about today. I don't have too much time, so it's kind of a bit of an overview, but there's more detail on the TropWATER website. So I just wanted to compare this to Snapper Island, and this isn't data that we collected, but it's data from the MMP, and it gives you an idea of over time what it looks like. And interesting, it's kind of what Steve was saying, that the southern side of Snapper Island, which is exposed to the Daintree River and that flood plume, you can see here the percent of hard coral cover just completely dropped off. Whereas if you compare this to the northern side, the deeper corals didn't fare so badly. There was a bit of a decline in the shallow corals. But interestingly, what we're seeing, well, what Tony and Avril Ailing, who are brave enough to go and dive this site for the marine monitoring program, what they are seeing is some recovery in these corals. So you can go onto their YouTube channel, and I've just taken a couple of screen grabs from that video showing some of this recovery. So really interesting to see that that kind of trajectory is happening in these corals already. In terms of those other reefs that I showed, I think that's going to take a lot longer for that mud to move off of those reefs, and then for any kind of recolonization to happen and new coral recruits to land there and settle. But there is possibility for recovery in some of these other systems. So a very brief overview of the corals, but when it comes to seagrasses, the challenge was really what did we know about seagrass before Cyclone Jasper? And so these green and white dots just show you where there's a data point for seagrass, and there is some data around Cairns, as you can see, and I'll talk about later. But throughout the rest of the region, these dots are from about 1980 onwards, so really kind of sparse in that coastal stretch, which is where that purple line is. So if we look at the data we collected in just the first year of these surveys, we managed to kind of fill in this data gap and understand, okay, where is there seagrass? And we've done a similar amount of surveys again, survey sites again this year to get a picture of what that looks like. So really valuable to be able to fill in that data gap, but it's hard to know what's been lost when you haven't got kind of in-depth information from the region. But what we have seen in this second year of doing these surveys is a recovery in some of those seagrass meadows. So that photo doesn't really show it, but there is seagrass in between all of those rocks, and that's some of the reef top seagrass that we've seen some slight recovery in. And then in the video, you can see some intertidal seagrass up north. And so we're seeing some of that seagrass bouncing back and dugong feeding trails throughout that as well. So that's really encouraging to see, just another year on of surveys, that we're starting to see some improvement in the habitat already. And interestingly, so further south, around Curramain Beach was outside of where our survey area was, but the Mandurah Rangers had started a monitoring program working with researchers here and Paul York and Tim Smith and Mike Rashid to develop a monitoring program for this region. And so they had picked up, so you can see here, this is the area of seagrass they'd mapped and the density. And it's starting to decline a little bit in terms of biomass by 2023. But when Cyclone Jasper hit in 24, you can see really big declines. So they had flooding there as well, and successive years of flooding with Cyclone Jasper. Having an impact there. And so you can see that those declines were extending even further south. And that just shows the value of some of these monitoring programs. And I should have said on the slide where I talked about what data we have, that there's a lot of these ranger groups who are starting up their own seagrass monitoring programs. And that provides really, really valuable data as we start to get more years of information about seagrass in their sea country. And this kind of just demonstrates that. So these impacts were felt throughout the region. So, what's the prospect of recovery? Well, we can kind of look at Cairns Harbour and the data collected as part of the port's monitoring program to show what the trajectory of recovery can look like. So, you can see in 2008, the top image there, that the seagrass was looking very healthy. And then there were successive years of La Nina, flooding, Cyclone Yazi that really just wiped out that seagrass. So, that's the meadow just off of the esplanade here in Cairns. But you can see that that did bounce back. So it took about a decade, and it came from the fact that there were remnant patches of seagrass and a seed bank still present. But the seagrass did return. And you can see what this looks like in terms of the images. So this is how the meadow looked in 2009. In 2011, not really much seagrass to look at there. Same in 2013. But by 2018, it was starting to look good, and again 2024. So this shows that seagrasses can recover, but that can take quite a lot of time. And we can contrast this. So this is kind of the same map for Cairns, but if we look at the same Marillion, which is further south over the same time scale, that's another port that's part of the port's monitoring program. This meadow also saw really big declines, and some of the meadows, the important meadows there, wiped out. But they weren't able to bounce back over this same period. They didn't really have a seed bank. Marillion isn't well connected in terms of propagules, so it's difficult for it to bounce back. So this brings me to the role of restoration, which can be a whole talk in itself. But there's restoration work being led by the team here, Mike Rashid, Paul York, Tim Smith, looking at how we can help this seagrass in Marillion. And that's working with the Mandurah Gundoy Rangers as well as the Rangers here in Cairns. So again, a really big collaborative project. So that's trialing transporting seagrass propagules from Cairns into Marillion, because that's really an area where we've identified that seagrass was present before. It has declined, but the conditions there are still good for seagrass to occur. So basically giving it a helping hand. And this started with small scale trials, and it's now using these propagules, but then also hovercrafts to transport seagrass sods as well. So hopefully that can be the topic of another TropWATER webinar, but just to highlight that there is a role for restoration in this kind of system. So this has been a really kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the impacts of extreme weather, and it can cause significant damage. Recovery is possible, but it does take time, and that's kind of what the Cairns data has shown us. And that's why it's so important to have these regular monitoring programs, especially at the meadow scale in these kind of dynamic meadows. And restoration can be used to help these ecosystems recover, but we need to understand what the right techniques are for all of these different species and where the right spots are to help the seagrass. So if you want to find out more about any of these, please have a look on the TropWATER website, and there's a whole list of reports that you can dive into and have more information about the Cyclone Jasper and the ports data. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the partners who've helped on this project. I will hand over to Adam to talk us through the mangrove impacts.
Thanks for that, Abby. I will just upload my slides and get them going. Okay, so thanks for that. Hopefully, my slides are showing up on your screens now. So, I'm going to be going over the mangroves and specifically looking at how, severe climatic extremes have been affecting mangroves across our region in multiple different ways. So, I'll mention about the flooding from Cyclone Jasper that Abby had mentioned, but it's a cumulative effect that we're seeing from a whole lot of different stresses in different places. So, firstly, what are mangroves? Mangroves, they're the vegetation that exists in the upper intertidal zone. So they share a niche with salt marsh, and they span between the mean sea level line and the highest and the high tide line. And how much mangrove there is versus how much salt marsh there is, and how they divvy that sharing up, that's highly dependent on how much rainfall there is. So if you're in a very wet area, like the wet tropics, Cairns, Hinchinbrook area, Tully, you hardly see any salt marsh at all. Versus as you move further down the coastline into the dry areas, for example, around Rocky, you get a lot more salt marsh relative to the mangroves. And when we do have salt marsh, what we also often see is that we've got most of your mangroves are down by the seaward edge. You have a salt marsh or a salt pan. And then at the back of that, you also have another thin line of mangroves in between the salt marsh and your terrestrial land. So that's your landward edge as well. Unlike most vegetation, mangroves, they are adapted to be living in salt water and inundated all the time. So, if you have too much water on your plants at home, they can rot and they can die. And mangroves are a lot more tolerant to that because they have the pneumatophores. So those are those roots that come out of the ground and they're effectively like snorkels and they allow the plants to breathe despite having this regular tidal inundation. And they can also handle salt water as well. Again, most terrestrial plants cannot, but mangroves can because they can sweat the salt out essentially. And they have this salty sap. So sometimes you see it on the leaves and sometimes around the bark, you get the salt excretes. And they're highly valuable. So we know that they support fisheries. They can help provide a good buffer of what's on land from storm surges. So they can dampen those sort of severe wave activity. They can help protect the coastline from erosion. Um, and yeah, I've mentioned there they've already got fisheries. I've put that in twice. But they are under substantial amount of climatic stress from multiple different mechanisms. Now, climate, I mentioned before that rainfall is a key determinant of how much mangrove there is to salt marsh. So, over time, if a rainfall is to decrease, you'll end up with less mangrove and more salt marsh, vice versa. Runoff, sorry, yep. So, runoff. Abby mentioned before about flooding can impact mangroves. They certainly can because it can not only, bring debris down, which can damage the trees downstream, it can then, encourage bank erosion or upstream erosion, which not only eats away at where the mangroves are, it can also deposit sediment. So the deposited sediment can end up on the mangroves, which can make it difficult for those pneumatophores or those snorkel-like roots to be able to breathe. But it can also put deposit sediment out around the river mouth, which allows places for new mangroves to be able to colonize as well. And we call that one depositional gain. And while they're really tolerant to water, they can still drown as well. So as you get sea level rise, as I mentioned, they occupy that niche between mean sea level and high tide. As that shifts over time, you could expect that the ones that are at the seaward edge to drown by having too much inundation and not enough oxygenation of the roots. So it can disrupt that balance. But they can also die of thirst. And I will mention an example of this over in the Gulf. But sometimes with climatic extremes, it's not that the sea level is too high, but it can also drop substantial amounts. And when that gets timed with uh, little to no rainfall, well, still like all plants, they need water. So if there is no water from the sea and there's no water from the rain, then they can also face substantial dieback. So storms and lightning, they can also have considerable impact on mangroves as well. So storms, I'll show you some of the impacts that can have, but it can effectively, the really high winds where you're getting up to close to 300 kilometers an hour, that can flatten areas that can flatten trees. And the lightning strikes, that can cause localized fires, which burn patches within the mangrove forest, and we call those light gaps. That is a part of a sort of natural succession cycle where the fire will burn patches and then that will grow over time. Lightning gap mosaic transition. So that's just some of the background. So how do we go about studying mangroves when we're specifically looking at climatic stresses? So climatic stresses are generally quite expansive in the way that they impact. They're often not overly localized. So if you're just doing transects or things on the ground where you're sort of doing surveys, you can miss a lot of the larger impacts because you're simply working at the wrong scale. So often when we want to look at climatic impacts, we'll need to do so from a helicopter or from a boat. A method that we often use that I've shown in the picture here, so that's my colleague Norm Duke, part of the mangrove team here, taking a photo up around Hinchinbrook. So what we would often do is we'd be in a little helicopter and we would hug the coastline and go up estuaries. And as we're doing that, we're taking oblique imagery. That oblique imagery is geo-referenced, it's high resolution, high frequency. That gives us a continuous record across an entire coastline. And we've been able to cover some really large areas. So collectively, we've almost done all of Northern Australia when you combine data sets that Norm's collected in the past versus some now. And I'll show you some of that later. But it gives us the ability to sort of provide a permanent record. And as we're going along the coastline, we can be scoring condition and appraising the presence of a range of different stresses. So to give you an example across the GBR, in 2023, we flew from Gladstone and we surveyed the coastline up to Cairns. And in this little map here, these bars, the green ones show the climatic stresses. So we're looking at a suite of different indicators of climatic stresses and their impacts, and we give it a score. And that's what we've got in the green bars for the various different reaches along the coastline. And then the orange ones are the non-climatic stresses. So this is your things like maybe people have cut down some forest or there's nets left in place or people have been four-wheel driving around the salt marsh or people have been developing urban infrastructure. So all of those things are non-climatic related. But what's really clear is that the climatic stresses, in terms of the scoring of our rapid assessment going along the coastline, far outweighs a lot of those other impacts. And it is really extensive. So it's at least 80% of the extent of the coastline. So, following up in terms of a straight line that we're traveling, we see constant impacts of things like the mangroves at the seaward edge falling into the water and the sea is chipping away at where the mangroves are and they're eroding. So there's the photo there from Fitzroy River to Corio Bay. That's just a sample from there. The other things that we also get is we can see at the landward edge, we can see where saltwater intrusion is coming in and we see some ecotone shift where mangroves are starting to move into those terrestrial zones if they're allowed to, so if they don't have drains or impoundments on the other side. And that dieback that you can see there is terrestrial forest that is dying because of salt water entering into there, and the mangroves are starting to take over that location. Now, while blue carbon is a really hot topic, as a part of the study, we found that there was 52 potential sites along this reach here, totaling 17,000 hectares, that could be potentially useful for restoration under the blue carbon method as an eligible method. Now, that might sound a lot, but when you consider that you've got, over 80% of the coastline eroding away, and if you were to add up that, really, these areas that we're talking about to be restored to offset that is a drop in a bucket. So it really emphasizes that, simply restoration under a carbon type method where it's a no-brainer that you're far better off to control the carbon in the first place and minimize that impact of climate change. Over in the Gulf of Carpentaria, this is where mangroves have died essentially of thirst. So in 2015, it coincided with an El Nino event that meant prolonged low sea level, coinciding with no rainfall. And what you can see is a photo there before 2015 with mangroves afterwards, and we can see that a lot of them along the coastal mangroves there, less so up the rivers, mostly along the coastline, face large scale dieback. And now this is extensive. This is 76 square kilometers over a coastline of 2,000 kilometers. And what we think has happened is that this is perhaps part of a cyclical collapse recovery cycle. So, a similar size event, also with a low sea level, occurred back in 1982. So, you can see a little graph there. So, at that indication, at that point one. And it was a very long time there where the mangroves hadn't recovered. Then they slowly recovered, reached their peak biomass, stabilized for a bit, and then they've had this lethal drying again. So that is about 33 years from one event to the other. But if that periodicity changes and it becomes more frequent, then what you might end up seeing, so for example, if it became more frequent, you might not fully get to that peak recovery in the time frame before the next event happens. And once the mangroves have died, it's really difficult often for mangroves to re-establish if it starts decomposing and it changes the height of that water. So this little plot here, we can see what it shows is that we can see some natural fluctuations in canopy cover with rainfall throughout the year, which is quite normal, but there's extremes. So once it gets too low or too high, it's showing that you can either die from desiccation or drowning. Cyclones. Now, cyclones create a mosaic of mangrove condition across the GBR. So this plot here is just showing a whole bunch of severe tropical cyclones that have crossed the shoreline and have impacted mangroves. Now they do so not just from wind breakage, as I mentioned earlier, but they also do so from storm surges where it causes erosion at the coast and even things like boat scars. So this is where somebody might have a yacht and the yacht gets dislodged from the storm surges in terms of it's no longer anchored to the ground and they drift up on the beach. We often see them here after a cyclone in Townsville where a yacht might get drifted up onto the beach. We've also seen them where they can drift and make a scar through the mangroves, and it basically carves out the mangroves as it goes through. And when we were doing our survey in 2023, Norm had pointed out to me some sites where he saw a boat scar that had occurred from back in the 80s, and we look at it now and it still hasn't recovered because of those changes where it can change the height of the sediment and shift it outside of that habitable zone. And I'll get onto it in a little bit soon, but flooding can have impacts as well, and I'll show you an example from Cyclone Jasper. So, I show you this picture here of the tropical cyclones occurring across the GBR coastline, but if we look down at the frequency of severe tropical cyclones over the decades, clearly between 2010 and 2019, there were over almost approximately twice as many severe tropical cyclones within this region than what there had been in the previous for each of the previous 4 decades. So it'll be interesting to see how much more that increases, which is going to, rampen up the frequency of that disturbance and potentially shortening that ability for that recovery. So this little picture here shows Cyclone Yasi from 2011 as it crosses the coastline, and most of the impacts for the mangroves generally occur on the south side of the cyclones due to the way that the winds are cycling. And this image here shows the NDVI change. So NDVI is a remote sensing indicator that we can use of vegetation from before the cyclone to afterwards. So we can see that much of this is red, which means that the indicator had dropped by more than 25%. So what does that mean in terms of recovery? Well, what we've found is that when we look at a range of different events and we look at how much that NDVI had dropped versus the amount of time it has taken to recover, there is a linear relationship. So something that's 25% is approximately 10 years post-event that you might get the canopy back. Now that's getting the canopy back, so that's telling you how much greenness there is. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the biomass underneath has got back to that pre-disturbance event. And this is a lot slower than our terrestrial comparisons, which recovered a lot quicker. So you got some photos here from 12 years after Cyclone Ingrid in 2005. There's still cyclone damage there. And also after Cyclone Ita in 2014, 3 years after, still substantial amount of damage. So, it's not always guaranteed because of that decomposition of the sediment. So Abby gave us a nice introduction into Cyclone Jasper, which is Australia's third wettest cyclone, or actually the rainfall was sort of after the cyclone in history, and this resulted in severe flooding in the Daintree and the Bloomfield rivers. In the Daintree, we saw substantial erosion across the banks, and Abby showed some nice photos of some scars up on up on hillsides as well, where there was considerable erosion. And this caused a huge amount of dieback across the mangroves within the Daintree, partly from that flood impact of things being flattened, but the large amount of dieback that happened there was not because of the physical impact, but because of all the sediment that has been transported downstream. And that sediment had ended up bearing a lot of the roots, and by bearing the roots, it means that the trees can't breathe, and when they can't breathe, they die. So we noticed that there was a lot of standing forests that were dead within the Daintree system. And when we got in there and had a look around, there was a lot of red clays from upstream that had deposited. And through looking at that work and looking across the transitions for the places that died and hadn't died, we found that a depth of about 10 centimeters was our threshold of sediment deposition that the trees can tolerate. And then it's quite a sharp tipping point. Once you sort of get more than 10 centimeters, that's when you really notice the trees are dead. In the Bloomfield, it was a different story. There was a less about the sediment mobilization, but more about floods essentially completely felling the areas. So these bottom photos show some places from before and after. If we look at the left column, those are showing the Daintree, and if we look at the ones on the right, that's showing the Jasper from previous surveys that we did in 2017 to others that we did in 2024, which reinforces that benefit of having the monitoring. And here we can see the NDVI again. So this isn't really NDVI. This is using our satellite imagery as an indicator to show where that dieback occurred. So my colleague Alejandro Navarro here in TropWATER, he produced these maps. The ones on the left show within 3 months of the disturbance, and then the ones on the right show within 12 months. So whilst there is still some recovery that has occurred, a lot of it is just really small sapling recovery. But you can see a year later, there's still a lot there, which is still bare soil. So to wrap up, I mentioned before that we have an awful lot of imagery across much of the Northern Australian coastline and overseas as well. I have created this app on the TropWATER website. If you head there, tropwater.com/coastal health tracker, you can go have a look at this app and you can look at all the different imagery from the various surveys that have been done through TropWATER over the years. We are still working through to upload a lot of our imagery because there's there's hundreds of gigabytes worth, and it's just taken a bit of time to get it up there. But you can get up there and you can see what we've got for most of the Queensland coastline already. And you can also see across the years as well. So you could compare 2017 with 2014 with 2015, and have a play around. It's a bit like Street View on Google, but we've made it well, we made it for shoreline, so it's like shore view. So thanks for listening, and if you want to get in contact with me, there is my email.